Hello and welcome to this year's Special Populations Conference. My name is Erin Van Manen and I work with the Refugee Education Center in Kent County. Thank you all for joining us today. I understand that it's a bit nuanced and new for us to go virtual, but the Department of Education in the Michigan office has asked us to speak on refugee community engagement, and we are so happy to do so. We love fostering relationships between refugee parents and schools and community partners. And I'm happy to share some of the strategies that seem to work for us. But before I get into today's subject, I would love to talk a little bit about who we are and what qualifies us to support professional developments like this. The Refugee Education Center was founded in 2006 by refugees and immigrants after they noticed a gap in academic success in their kindergartners through 12th graders. And we started an after-school tutoring program called Project Fa'ulu, and that program still runs today. But since then, we've expanded in a number of areas to better address the academic and educational successes of our refugee neighbors. Our newest program is our early childhood education services, and we work with about 100 refugee students that are under age 5, with a specific focus on dual language development and culturally responsive care. We also have launched a high school transitions program where we work specifically with students who are high schoolers or about to be high schoolers to make sure that they are on track to graduate on time and have the tools to go beyond graduation to college, trade school, whatever occupation or career that they are excited about. Our after-school tutoring program that I originally mentioned is still in existence today. We support 150 students from kindergarten all the way up to 12th grade every year. And in that program, we see really great success rates with at least 80% of our students increasing in one letter grade in at least one subject area. We have a number of community support services where we work with refugee communities in their engagement in schools and in the community at large. Our refugee navigation services work with about 21 school districts each year in the support of working with refugee parents. We do a lot of ongoing community connections and referrals to make sure that information is getting to populations appropriately and accurately. And we specifically work with parents on making sure that basic needs are met so they can focus on school with their children. Things like health, housing, employment services. We make ongoing referrals to organizations who are really great at providing those services. And then our final program, excuse me, virtual is it's such a interesting experience. So you're just going to have to bear with me during this time. Our final service is our consultation to schools, community partners, and local agencies like yours and this conference to make sure that you feel equipped in engaging refugee communities and parents at large. So we try really hard to tailor professional developments, consultations, specifically to agencies that we're working with to make sure that they feel prepared in working with refugees. So to get to our topic today, we are talking about refugee community engagement. And I think it's important to highlight what engagement looks like to the Refugee Education Center. How are we determining that what we are doing is successful? So a big part of that is recurring participation. It's not that one and done, we host a meeting, it's really highly attended, and then we try and host a similar meeting on the same subject area and no one comes. It's assessing educational advancement during workshops. You know, once they're there, are they getting the information in a way that works for them and they understand and feel better about the subject area once they came. And it's providing somewhat intangible, but a safe environment for refugee communities to provide honest feedback. Oftentimes we'll have community partners or agencies host meetings, and refugees feel nervous to share some of the common barriers, either for pride's sake or cultural expectations. And so working hard to provide a safe environment to get honest insights on what can help communities is a big goal. An example I like to give is when we started the engagement of refugee parents in partnership with schools. Our clients weren't going to things like parent-teacher conferences or parent nights or family meetings or anything. It was about 2% of participation rates out of those 300 parents that we were serving annually. And once we started to address it through the measures that I'm going to talk about today, we turned that 2% into 45 to 50% of our clients participating consistently in school events and et cetera. So the first thing that we're going to talk about today is how you foster trust. Trust in schools and in agencies sometimes is a little bit harder to acquire from populations that have been persecuted or have come from unstable areas, have been subjected to systemic militant rule, some of those things that really garner appropriate expectations for agencies. So the refugee community is definitely not an exception here. And some things that really work for us are listed in this slide, but the commitment to consistent messaging is really, really important. And this year is no exception. And it was really hard for our organization to go into houses with refugee families and say we didn't know what was going to happen with COVID-19, and we didn't know what school was going to look like, and we didn't know that what changes there could be, how those changes will impact families. It was really hard to have our consistent message be, we didn't know. But we were able to foster some trust by saying, we don't know some of these things, but our schools and our partner agencies and our center are totally committed to having you and your child have access to education. And we were consistent in saying, the things that we could help with. But consistent messaging, even when that message is hard or uncertain, really helps with gaining trust and commitment of families. Another strategy that we've really encouraged within our local school districts and in our organization itself is representation of the populations that you're trying to work with. There is something to be said about sharing language and cultural experiences, and it immediately fosters trust. Just from a personal experience, I'm sure that I'm going to, if I'm traveling and abroad, and if I meet someone from Michigan and they tell me that there's a really great pizza shop around the corner, I'm going to buy in a little bit more than maybe I would have if somebody else would have told me. So what the Refugee Education Center has done is broken down our refugee navigators and our kind of community engagement staff into language and cultural representation to engage the populations we're hoping to work with. And we saw a huge increase in the acknowledgement of parent-teacher conferences, because the individuals that we are working with are typically community leaders, and they share the same cultural experiences and are able to relay messaging in a way that is more received just from, how they're communicating. Is it stopping by the house? How are they demonstrating the importance of these things? And so we've seen a huge increase of buy-in once we started having staff that reflected our populations. Another way that we buy into, commitment and fostering this trust with refugee communities is being honest about the journey ahead. It's really easy to try to avoid some of the hard things that are coming up when we're working with extremely vulnerable populations that already have a lot on their plate. We're working with populations who have language, cultural, and traumatic barriers, and we definitely don't want to be the ones to say, well, and also there's this, once they have arrived in the United States. But we commit to being honest about some of the hard parts of being in a new community, trying to figure out what transportation looks like, some of the barriers and social norms that might be unfamiliar. We love to talk about those things. And families typically respond to, the directness of the reality. These families have been advocating for themselves and working really, really hard to start the new journey for their children. And so the more that they can know about some of the barriers that they might be experiencing and how that might impact their journey moving forward and joining our communities is something that they want to know. Another way that we work hard to gain trust from families is providing clear expectations. And that is, this is kind of a combining of what I've talked about in the last 3 bullets. Providing clear expectations at your school on what is the start time, what products do they need, how will virtual learning look, what is attendance mandatory, providing those clear expectations in a way that families understand. So that means language access and reminders, and often just providing all of this information as early and as often as you can really helps with buy-in. The last thing that I want to talk about a little bit is provider adaptability. So when, I've talked about it a number of times in this slide, but when we're working with populations that are particularly vulnerable, it's really hard to go to a agency or a formal school. It kind of swings the pendulum a little bit to make families feel somewhat insecure. It's really intimidating, specifically with cultures who revere educators and school itself. So the more you can level the playing field by kind of getting off your turf and going to places and spaces that these communities already have relationships and feel established in, like churches or community centers or their homes, is a better way to build buy-in with refugee communities. At least that's what we've seen at our center. So moving along, and this, kind of flows into, creating relationships and fostering trust, is creating the sense of mutuality. So refugee communities come into the States and receive services, and it feels like sometimes it's been expressed from refugee families that they have to kind of forget who they were in order to be successful moving forward. And we definitely don't want that to be the case. We want this sense of full participation and integration into the community that they're calling home. And that means that they're bringing their native cultures and their strengths and talents into the community. They're bringing what makes them to the school and place of employment and communities that they're being a part of. And so how schools and educational institutions can support that is joining into native cultures whenever possible. Participate in the traditions that your diverse communities are a part of, because it's often not represented. And the more that you can show flags and food and language and holidays in your classrooms and in your schools, the more appealing and kind of honoring to families that you do care about their stories and you want them to be a part of it. And it kind of opens this channel to give families the opportunity to have a say. Excuse me. So at our center, we are participating or acknowledging things like Eid. When we have community meetings, it's always a potluck. And, you know, we don't schedule things on holidays for religious minorities just because they aren't represented in the American calendar. Hard along that line, I would say to do your homework about existing expectations and formal educational backgrounds. You know, you're getting to know these families individually, and you know, when you're creating that sense of mutuality, you want to know information about who they are and what their strengths are, and educational backgrounds is part of that. And this is where you learn where some of those breakdowns might be occurring in your engagement and your participation in family events or parent-teacher conferences, or you know, the parent association even. You know, you'll learn perhaps that educators were totally revered, and it would be silly for you to engage in any capacity about your child's well-being in education, because teachers absolutely know what should happen in their child's educational future. This is where you learn about expectations on, you know, is kindergarten optional? Was school optional? Was the parent that you're speaking to an academic? Does he or she have 3 or 4 degrees in their native country? Some of that value and how the educational system was implemented in native countries will really shape how you navigate some of the landscape in engaging refugee and immigrant populations. Again, this kind of creates, we kind of go back with this creating, getting creative with your meeting spaces and families. This is about provider adaptability again, which was referenced in my last slide. Sometimes schools feel very intimidating for families struggling with language barriers or have past traumas surrounding schools. And so again, you know, I talked about this in the last slide, but areas where there's this sense of neutrality will kind of swing that pendulum back. Again, you know, I keep referencing that kind of feeling lopsided. Getting your families in spaces where they have language access, as indicated in my next slide, really creates this equal relationship. And that's what we're going for. We want families who have felt ostracized and exiled for a number of reasons to feel confident, comfortable, and having the ability to engage with you in a really respectful way. And so getting in spaces that they feel familiar, like their homes, their churches, their mosques, their community centers, local agencies that they feel really comfortable at, and providing access and kind of championing this idea of having language access during those meetings is when you get the real feedback, is when you get real engagement and ownership in some of these areas that you're hoping to get that. Our next slide is parent feedback. And this is really critical in that recurring participation part. So, you know, a lot of these first things that we've been talking about are to get refugee parents to feel comfortable and safe and to attend things that you're hoping to have them attend, and shape their children's futures with you and really join in. Parent feedback is when they feel comfortable to to talk through some of the challenges that they're experiencing that might be getting in the way of that. And I think it's really important for us to talk about how past experiences really shape the comfort and confidence level of sharing feedback that will help the student be successful, but also the engagement process. So I've listed some things in blue here. You know, we're dealing with populations that have experienced trauma, that haven't had trustworthy agencies in their native countries at times. Educational access has been wildly varied in every refugee experience. And then, past societal expectations. Is feedback even a measure in their native countries? And sometimes that's not true. So when we're talking about, the last slide of creating this mutuality and really understanding past experiences, it shapes how you're asking for feedback. So is feedback having to be totally anonymous? Is it coming through a community leader or a center that refugee families have trust in, because they're nervous about engaging with schools because you are so respected that it's scary to talk to you about some of the shortcomings that may be at home or at school with their student. So is it an assessment? Is it word of mouth? There are so many ways that gaining feedback can be harnessed to reflect the population that you're working with. And I do want to talk through some of the cultural norms that, are absolutely going to impact whether or not you're going to get feedback from communities. There are some communities that have no problem being totally assertive and saying, all right, this is what I want. This is how we need to do this. And then you have other refugee communities who are so nervous about saying no, or that they can't because it's so disrespectful that they just won't say. And so you'll talk to them about, hey, how are things going, and what would you like to see differently? And I'd love to have a meeting with you. Could you attend? And they will say, oh yeah, because they can't say no because it's totally disrespectful. And so we like to ask other kind of sideways questions, I call them, where it's, how would you get there? What questions do you have for me now? Just to kind of get this comprehensive confirmation that attendance will be thing, and they will be able to provide you feedback in a way that's going to be helpful. And then the final slide that I have here with parent feedback is fight the urge to hurry. A lot of cultural norms are much slower than American cultures, and you might not get that feedback right when you walk in the door. It might be a conversation, it might be slower. And we're working with refugee communities at our center, and we're one of a number of agencies that are doing so. And there's a lot of need out there, and so it's really, and you're dealing with a lot of students, and so it's really easy to kind of try to check those boxes in those 15-minute time slots that you guys have to adhere to most of the time. But that sometimes doesn't work for immigrant communities. And so I just wanted to put that in there as sometimes feedback slower than expected, and it might not happen right away. So the more we can fight that urge to hurry, the higher success that we're going to probably have. My final slide is kind of a beware slide. And I think it's super important as we're trying to engage a refugee population. It's really easy to kind of say, oh, this works for the Congolese population. Oh, this works for the Burmese population, in an algorithm sort of way. And I want to just caution you and your teams and your communities and your agencies to beware of one, lumping stories in together to find success, in an ethnic kind of grouping or a nationality grouping, and to caution you against gauging parent investment or attendance um, on how they care and their level of caring about their child's future. Um, Oftentimes, I am told by refugee communities that the reason that they're in the United States and that they took the chance of leaving everything they knew to come to the United States was to create safety and stability with their families, and that education was one of the biggest components of why refugee communities are coming to the United States. You know, it's not easy to leave everything you know. And so for us to gauge parent investment on attendance or community buy-in into a new space that they may not be able to address just yet is a really dangerous thing. And we're working with communities who may have layered um, things on top of them that are really just getting in the way of being able to talk to you as a teacher or as a school leader or a district leader even, you know, dealing with uh, job schedules, um, cultural expectations, um, competing resources. And so there may be a want, but they might not know how to share or engage appropriately, and they just might not be able to have the capacity right now. The other thing is that cultural norms may be unintentionally misleading regarding parent engagement. So I talked a little bit about this in the last slide where we were talking about how some cultures are afraid or do not want to disrespect you in any capacity because they revere you so much. I kind of give the example of walking into your heart surgery and giving your surgeon tips before he opens you up. That's how it feels sometimes to refugee parents when they engage with teachers, because they revere you, that they have no intention of disrespecting your work. And so oftentimes that can kind of feel like a recoiling of refugee parents, just because they're trying to give you respect. The other thing that I would love for you to take away today is that no refugee experience is the same. It's really easy to try and address populations at large, and kind of say, well, this works for this community. And short term, that you might see somewhat of a peak in attendance and engagement. But long term, if you're doing that generalization, you really don't see the results that you're hoping to see, or the investment that is really kind of quintessential to the success of both refugee family and schools and community agencies. So please refrain from, you know, some of that nationality or language-based grouping, because each experience is different. And to kind of further that point, I've got some readings listed here. There's a TED Talk out there called The Danger of a Single Story. And this author talks about just the notion of being African, and how she was kind of lumped into everybody else when she came to the United States. And then there are a couple of refugee women who have written books listed here. Stealing Buddha's Dinner, which is a Vietnamese refugee who was resettled in Grand Rapids. And then The Girl Who Smiled Beads. And she, the final author, talks about very honestly about the long-term effects of some of the cultural shock that she endured, and the cultural expectation in the United States that I think would be really helpful for those avid readers out there. And I think we're a wrap. I just wanted to take the time to thank everyone for tuning in virtually. I know it is somewhat bizarre, and I wish I could engage with you a little bit more, but we just wanted to take time and say that this year has been a doozy, but we're so thankful for our committed educators and those of you who are still learning in any capacity is really beautiful to see. So thanks so much for participating in my session today, and we hope to see you in person soon.